the Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I am your host, Patrick McFarland, coming here with a discussion about crowdfunded government, and I'm being joined by Theodore. Theodore, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for having me here. Very excited to discuss the concept of voluntarily crowdfunding all government programs.
Awesome, man. Well, let's just start out by, why don't you tell us how you came across this idea? Or tell us a bit about your project.
Sure. Well, about a decade ago, I was in college for social policy, political science. I love the idea of government programs, laws, trying to figure out why they exist, what they were for. I used to be very left-leaning, a big believer in government. And one of the big projects that I was always working on with my friends, just as a thought experiment, was how do we design government? Why is government the way that it is? And the more that I thought about it, I really came to the conclusion, man, we all just need a machine in our pocket that lets us decide what to do with our tax dollars instead of just submitting them. But, you know, back in the 2000s, it was a crazy idea. I mean, we had these bulky, awful phones in our pocket that couldn't do anything. It seemed like such a crazy thought experiment that was completely unrealistic, that we could ever consider voluntarily crowdfunding a government. It was the words I would never even use the phrase crowdfunding back then. Fast forward to a few years ago, and I've just been ranting and raving about the idea of why don't we voluntarily pay for government and stop the concept of government telling us what to do. And I've just been speaking to myself, basically, friends and myself. And at a certain point, enough people were encouraging me to try to make something of it. You're always talking about it. Why don't you do something about it? And so at a certain point, I kind of put all the pieces together. We have the technology at this point in time. We have proven the success of crowdfunding, which is that people can put in small amounts for big projects. And I got to thinking, why not the biggest project? Why not our federal, state, and local government budgets? Why is it that crowdfunding can only be used for these small projects or these non-governmental programs? And the more that I thought about it and started developing it, I decided to start writing a blog. I decided to start battling on Twitter. And the more people I was talking to, the more refined my ideas got. I have a lot of good feedback. My favorite kind of feedback is the kind that disagrees with crowdfunding government, because every time somebody's brought something up to me that was a reasonable problem with crowdfunding government, I've slightly tweaked the system. And ever since then, I've just been spreading the idea. Last year, I did a couple open mics where they had like an opportunity to speak at like a spoken word kind of a deal. And I just set up an easel and I just explained crowdfunding government for 10 minutes. And then I opened up the floor to questions, passed the microphone around the room for 10 minutes. I did that a couple times, had really good feedback. People were excited about an interesting idea, and I've just been trying to talk about it ever since then. And if you've seen me out in the Twitter streets at crowdfunding gov, I just like to take on as many people as I can, those that agree with me, those that disagree with me, and I just keep trying to improve the idea.
All right, right on, man. I can definitely appreciate that. I think so. The URL for your website too is www.crowdfundedgovernment.com, correct?
That is correct. We got the blog there, and every time I think of something or I find a website, I have a full explanation of my interpretation of what a crowdfunding government system would look like, some frequent questions that I seem to receive every time I speak in public about it or I chat on Twitter about it. And it just gives me a chance to put more than 140 characters. Well, I guess it's now 280. Just gives me a chance to put more out there than I was before. So that's what I've been trying to constantly go for, is trying to create as many platforms as possible for me to share the ideas. And I have a section of that website that's specifically set up just for websites that mention crowdfunded government or some variety of it. I haven't even had a chance to write blog posts about it. So there's a lot of content on there now, and I'm hoping there's going to be a lot of content there in the future as I continue to see more of crowdfunded government discussed in the wild. So I'm trying to take all these different ideas that I see out there where people suggest ways to voluntarily fund government, and I'm trying to put them all under one umbrella, this crowdfunded government idea.
Okay, excellent. And I'll include the link to your webpage in the show notes here. But so as we're going forward here, before we get into the actual technicalities of how this would work, theoretically, do you want to explain what your beliefs are personally? Like, are you a libertarian? Are you a Rothbardian? What's the deal with that?
Sure. So personally, I came to this idea definitely from a libertarian approach. Just in general, believing that the government's role is to maximize liberty in our lives, and trying to mesh that with, well, if government's trying to increase liberty in our lives, if that's the purpose of it, well, how do we have all of these oppressive systems that we must put money into, contribute to a bunch of things that don't seem to increase our liberty? And personally, I do lean libertarian on a lot of issues, but what I really like about the design for crowdfunded government is that it truly is an apolitical movement, in that the idea of voluntarily crowdfunding government at a local, state, and federal level gives a chance for people to do what they want with government. So just because I think it has the opportunity to promote values relating to liberty, that's fine. But ultimately, it would be determined by what people actually choose, which programs actually are chosen to be developed and funded. So even though I think that's how it best serves, that was my original intent in design, I've found supporters all across the political spectrum, even those who don't take a strictly libertarian view of things, who could find voluntarily crowdfunding government to support their political beliefs. The real argument always comes down to, what do you think other people want to contribute their money for government to do? And that's the beauty of it, is I can have my political opinions, but in crowdfunded government, it's irrelevant. What we're really asking is, what are the roles and functions of government programs that people actually want to pay for?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, although I would have some quibbles with it, and we'll get into that, but it seems like you're generally, from what I understand, what you're trying to do is take the free market aspect and apply it to government programs. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a lot of wisdom in the crowd, and that is that when you allow a lot of people to make individual decisions, you will generally get a wise result. There's no guarantee to that, and there's all sorts of examples where that's not true. But in general, if we allow a free market of funding, my theory is that you eventually have a system that is the best result for the most amount of people, because everybody had a chance to do some type of contribution in that system. Yeah.
And I understand the free market aspect of it, definitely. When you talk about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, I mean, that's the mechanism that we're describing, is, all these individuals transacting in their own best interest, and that generally producing a better result.
Yeah, so that's the theory. And then, of course, in practice, that's where things get interesting. But yeah, that's the basic theory, is that we want to take government from some type of a top-down order for give us your money, and here are the programs that we're going to do, and kind of reverse it and say, all right, here's the available programs. What do the market of the citizens' dollars, what do you guys actually want to do of these available programs? So it essentially attempts to create a market of government dollars, where currently it's the exact opposite. Currently, there is no market of government dollars, unless you want to get into the topic of lobbying, which I'm sure we'll touch on eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely, I can't quibble with the sentiment of it, because so I'm sure the audience is familiar with my journey. If you've been a listener of the podcast for a while, I used to be a classical liberal, and then I kind of ran into Rothbard and the ideas of anarcho-capitalism and voluntarism. And I think that's where this conversation is generally going to trend from my perspective. But why don't you talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of how you see this system working?
Sure. So at the simplest version of a voluntarily crowd-funded government, we essentially have no change to the current political system. The voting would be the same. People would still elect their politicians under our current constitutional framework. All of the existing political institutions would still exist and would still perform roughly the same function in terms of legislatures, executives, etc. The difference in the crowdfunded government system versus the current system comes in the way that laws are implemented. So currently, the way that it works is you involuntarily are ordered under penalty of law at gunpoint. You must contribute money to the government, and the government with that money spends it on whatever laws they pass that create whatever programs they want. The twist in crowd-funded government is that the politicians still create the laws. The laws still lay out programs that the government is offering to do. However, your money is not involuntarily taken for those programs. The twist is you choose as a citizen which programs you want to contribute to and how much. Each of those programs has a transparent budget, and depending on the amount of funding that each program receives, it will perform its functions differently. So we currently budget for 100% of a government program, and it does only what 100% of the program can do. Under a voluntarily crowdfunded government system, every program would have to be ready to operate at different levels of funding depending on how much it voluntarily collected. In order to do that, I suggested, and obviously every level of government should be choosing their own way of implementing the system, I suggested a 3-year funding cycle. Year 1, you fund for 3 years out. Year 2, you fund for 2 years out. The 3rd year, you prepare for that budget. And then finally, the year that you've been funding for, you operate under that budget with an emergency fund if needs change. And that system is run for every government program concurrently, so that there's always a funding cycle, there's always a secondary funding cycle, there's always a preparation, and there's always an execution. So it's a 3-year rolling cycle, but obviously that's just an example of how you could do it. There's certainly a need for variation depending on which level of government and exactly which programs are operating, but that's the basic idea. We want to give people the chance to choose how much they want to give to the programs, and then the programs operate based on how much they collected. And over time, that system will be self-correcting. Either people will be fine with reduced services, or they will realize that it's a mistake to not fund certain programs, and they will choose to give more. We don't believe that politicians have the ability to make these kind of decisions as well as the market does.
Yeah. I would agree with that last statement. And one question I wanted to ask was, under the system, would it be only private individuals that would be able to give, or would entities like businesses and corporations be able to give money? And would the donations also be transparent? Because I think there might be some privacy issues in terms of, seeing who gives what to where, or people could foresee that.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, I don't see any problem with allowing businesses, organizations, or people to give in whatever structure they want. And the reason being is if you restrict a corporation or an organization of people from giving, well, all they're going to do is just have the individuals that make up that organization give the funding. So I don't feel that you have any sort of an advantage by restricting the giving. And we can get into some of the corporatist and lobbying aspects of allowing that decision in just a second, because in my opinion, that's one of the strengths of crowdfunded government.
Okay, yeah. What about the privacy concerns though? Because I mean, although it is a public corporation or a public, system, a public entity, I could see some people I know. So specifically, there were problems in the past with people giving to, although private organizations, but if that was made public, I know that people have been harassed. People who have given to private organizations have been harassed publicly and doxxed because of their charitable giving. Obviously, since this is a public system, it's a little different. But I could see some of the same, problems happening there. Maybe someone doesn't want, a certain public program to be funded. They just look and see who is funding this program and they go and harass them.
Yeah, you raise a very good point. And to that, I don't think there is a definitive answer other than to say that we should allow each level of government that's taking the funding to make their own decisions. But if I had to come up with a blanket idea or some type of a summary, it seems to me the most advantageous system for all parties involved would be to allow anonymous contributions or to allow public contributions. Because you do bring up a very good point. If people are voluntarily choosing to support government programs that others disagree with, the last thing we want is somebody to be intimidated or for the threat of force to prevent somebody from doing what they voluntarily want to do. So that is a consideration that I've thought about, because I've gone back and forth with a number of people about this idea about should all the donations, there's good arguments to make on all sides. Should all of the donations be transparent in a way of allowing everybody to see who's contributing to what, or should everything be anonymous so that there is no possibility of people being intimidated or harassed for choosing to support certain government programs? There's good arguments on both sides. I just think every level of government needs to make that decision on their own. But more importantly, I think a mixed arrangement seems to be the best. But ultimately, there is definitely a concern if you go too far anonymous, because there needs to be accountability at some point in the system that allowing somebody inside the system to eventually reveal who's giving to what is a concern. But again, that's an issue that I believe every level of government can deal with individually, especially based on the nature of the programs that they're offering. I don't think there's a good one-size-fits-all, but there's as you brought up, a great debate to be had of the advantages and disadvantages of both full transparency and a full anonymous system of giving.
Okay, and that kind of begs the question of the lobbyist question. So it sounded like you were kind of wanting to get into that. Why don't you address that issue?
Sure. Lobbying was one of the things that really spurred this idea, or I really realized that I was onto something big, because when you're talking about lobbying, the way that lobbying currently works is you have an interest group, whether it's a corporation, a group of people, or even an individual with just a very big interest in some sort of government program. And all those people have to do in order to get the government to spend money. My favorite example is some type of a government military widget. That government military widget costs $1 billion. And all that the group has to do in order to get that government military widget is get the politicians to write a law to fund it. The cost of doing so, let's say, is less than $1 billion. Government lobbying is one of the greatest returns on investment possible, because all you have to do is convince politicians through lobbying to write the law, and then voila. Now you have an incredible return on investment, because all of that money that you spent on lobbying is now being doubled, tripled, 10 times, 100 times your investment coming back from the taxpayer. So what crowdfunded government allows you to do is to stop that ability of someone to give a small amount for lobbying for a big amount from government. Basically, if you want the government to spend $1 billion on a government widget, somebody has to give $1 billion. It essentially makes government a one-to-one relationship and eliminates the possibility for lobbying being done for corrupt reasons or for lobbying to be self-serving. The only situation that results from a crowdfunded government that's happening voluntarily is money in, money out. And lobbying goes from the greatest return on investment possibly out there into something that would only be done by special interest groups in the best interests of the people and the government. The only people that would be spending money in order to help modify the government and choose how it's operating and which programs it's funding would just be in the best interest of the government programs, because there would no longer be a return on spending money to get the government to spend money, because you can no longer force the government to spend the tax dollars. The only way to get that return is for people voluntarily to choose to give to it. So that's what excites me about the crowdfunded government idea, because a lot of people feel that lobbying is hopeless, that there's nothing that we can do. Money in politics is here to stay. And that may be true. Money in politics may be here to stay, which is why we need to somehow take away these perverse incentives that lobbyists have to create laws that then return more money to the people who funded the lobbyists in the first place.
Okay, I understand that. And I think, but one of the problems that I foresee with that too is that it's not just like big corporations don't just get money purely through government contracts. You know, there's other things that they do, like one of the biggest things is the government creating regulations that make it harder for small businesses to compete. So therefore it creates a de facto monopoly for a certain, group of corporations to monopolize a certain industry. And so you're not merely just dealing with government contracts, but you're also dealing with the writing of laws that favor particular companies. And in terms of that return on investment, it doesn't require money, specifically being handed out, but it's the regulatory power of the state that is the return on the investment. You know what I mean?
Yes, you do bring up a good point. The only way that crowdfunded government can help limit that, it certainly can't reduce or eliminate it, but it can help not entirely, but partially deal with that issue of regulations becoming burdensome, which would be that every regulation requires an enforcement mechanism, and that enforcement mechanism needs to be voluntarily funded. So that is still an opportunity for a regulatory enforcement mechanism to be funded. And by all means, that isn't something that crowdfunded government can solve completely, but it's at least something that, in order for those mechanisms to operate, they need to be funded. So there is at least somewhat of a stopgap available under the crowdfunded government system. But you do raise a good point, which is if the enforcement of a certain burdensome regulation is less than the benefit that it provides to a corporation, you still have the same issue under our current system. And that's a perfect example of how crowdfunded government doesn't have all the answers, and it's certainly not a perfect system. It's just better than what we have now. I mean, you're still going to have that existence of regulations that don't cost much to enforce, but that provide a really big net benefit to certain large players in an industry. So that's a very good point that you bring up, and it just underlines the fact that crowdfunded government is an improvement, not perfect, but it's a great improvement over the system that we do have, but certainly can't solve all of the problems that are presented by government regulation.
Alrighty. Yeah. So, well, I'm gonna get into my critiques from a Rothbardian point of view. I guess I kind of have touched on that, but, one thing, cause what we've kind of discussed is that this is an effort to have the government perform in a way that a private enterprise would do. Would that be an accurate assessment?
That's a good way of describing what government could be compared to what it is now.
Okay. But from that perspective, one quibble that I had is that the government fundamentally does not operate in the way that a business does, because from a Rothbardian perspective, the government, well, from any perspective actually, the government does not, there are two ways by which a man coming into the world without anything acquires resources. He can either do it through voluntary exchange or he can do it by brute force. And this would be voluntary exchange. But fundamentally, the government does not operate that way. The government, and I understand that crowdfunding government is an effort to trend it in that direction, but the government does not have any feedback mechanisms that the free market would, even with voluntary exchange, I feel. And the government fundamentally operates as a monopoly because in the areas, the way that it performs is that it monopolizes certain essential public goods. And I say essential in quotations because I don't think that the public goods theory, and sorry, we're kind of getting into technical terms here, but the public goods theory I think is arbitrary. But that's one of my quibbles, is that the government monopolizes certain industries and therefore they can charge or do whatever they want. There's no pricing mechanism there. And within that space, if you have a certain program that is not funded voluntarily or not funded enough, the public is going to blame that on the free market. And essentially, too, another point that I wanted to make is that if the government is going to monopolize a certain industry like roads, law, utilities, private, but still monopolized, we want them to do that job. You know what I mean? And so if it doesn't get funded enough, people will blame this on the free market.
Yes, that is a legitimate concern that ultimately the system of crowdfunding government may not deliver what it is that the people want or think they want, and then ultimately they end up blaming a boogeyman, which is the free market, for something that actually wasn't the cause that they should be angry about. That is true. You certainly can't prevent people's perceptions from not matching reality.
Yeah. And, well, another problem that I had was because essentially these industries are monopolized. You run into what Mises described as the socialist calculation problem, in that when you have a monopolized industry or an industry like the state where you're not selling goods and operating on a profit loss margin like that, you don't have any mechanism by which to accurately meet the demand of consumers, their individual demand. And I understand that with voluntary government, you are giving, you are funding the government in an abstract kind of way. But my quibble specifically is that it is not nearly as good as a private industry, because when you're dealing on a one-to-one level with a private industry, you pay for exactly what you're getting. If you want someone to come by and watch your house as a security firm, you pay for those visits, whereas with the crowdfunded government, you're all dealing in abstractions. And I don't think that the pricing mechanism would work essentially in that system.
The argument that I have to make against that is, the one that I might think about would be a pothole repair program for a municipality. Let's say that the budget that they set allows for the repair of 100% of potholes in a given year. If people only contribute 50% of that budget, only 50% of the potholes get filled. And the citizens would have two choices to make: accept that certain goods are not, certain services that they expect the government to provide are not being provided, or they're going to need to provide more money in order to actually make the government deliver what they want from it. And our argument in this situation would be that crowdfunded government is self-correcting in terms of a simple explanation like a pothole. But if you take even more complex systems, there would eventually be a feedback mechanism that does allow for citizens to make changes over the long run, over how much government can do and what they actually want from it. What if it turns out that although 100% of the potholes were not filled, 50% of the potholes were the ones that were actually on busy streets in the middle of the street, and the other 50% were on minor streets, alleys, in back corners where very few people were affected by them. And it turns out that people were just fine with a reduced budget for the pothole program. It's a small example, but one in which that is part of the fundamental belief of the crowdfunded government system, which would be that the citizens will self-correct if the government is not providing what they want from it. Because ultimately, the citizens wouldn't have anybody to blame but themselves. They wouldn't be able to say, well, we want the government to do more. Well, if you did, the market would have provided more funding for that particular program.
Well, and I do understand that. And I think that this is what you're describing, I think, is a very rough estimate of how much things would cost. But without the profit and loss motive, there would be no way to determine how much it costs to fill a pothole. And furthermore, there'd be no way to determine how much you would pay your workers who are filling the potholes because there's no pricing mechanism. You know,
the way that we look at it is every program is made up of a few characteristics. There's the amount of labor for 100% of the program's budget. There's an amount of labor. There's an amount of direct material. There's an amount of equipment, and there's an amount of assets, like let's say capital assets like buildings. Of those, we could clearly define how much of each is needed in order to accomplish 100% of the budgeted goal. And then as you go down, let's say 90%, 80%, down to 10%, you would reduce the amount of each of those categories. And I do agree with you that when you're dealing with public goods that the government deals with, there's not always such a straightforward answer, and it is difficult to make those kind of decisions. But that's the improvement that we see upon the current system, which is, first of all, let's start with transparent budgets. Let's start with understanding you want 100% of the pothole program. Here's exactly how much labor it takes. Here's exactly how much pothole filling material it takes. Here's how much it costs in machinery, the equipment that fills those potholes, and here's how much it costs for the assets, the actual buildings that house those particular pieces of equipment and the materials that are used on the job. We believe that you can create a transparent budget for every government program at 100%. And from that 100%, we just need to go down the scale in order to figure out exactly what, if you collect 50% of a budget, what does that mean in terms of all those different characteristics and an end result, how many potholes does that actually fill?
Okay. I still have quibbles with the specific, the actual details of how much things would cost without the actual market. But another thing I kind of wanted to move on to, another thing that I see is in terms of the profit motive is that government, essentially doesn't produce anything. Government, all it is good at doing is taking from one and putting to another and destroying things. And without the profit, and so without someone profiting from it, there is no surplus with which to invest into capital investments and to produce something that is more efficient. You know what I mean?
I guess the only question that I would have is, under our current system, how does that exist anyway? Where is that profit motive in our current system of government?
There isn't, in my opinion.
So, I mean, that's one of the most important things that I always try to keep in mind about crowdfunded government is there are very good arguments against crowdfunded government, but a lot of those arguments are also good arguments against government in general. And I always try to make sure that if we're going to levy a criticism against crowdfunded government, that we make sure that it's specifically in regards to the voluntarily crowdfunding portion of it, as opposed to just government in general. That's where I get into a lot of wars on Twitter with anarchists and libertarians who don't like government in general. And so I'm pushing the government light. I'm still pushing government. I'm still a statist in some respect. I'm still believing that the state should and must do things. Whether that's actually my personal opinion or not, it's something that I have to realistically include in a plan for crowdfunded government. So you do raise an excellent point. I completely agree with you. That's one of my quibbles with government in general.
Okay, yeah, but and see that's one of the reasons why I couldn't advocate for a crowdfunding government. Just because we could talk about pragmatism, versus pure ideology. But I would always come on the end of pure ideology. So
yes, and yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, by the way, because that is the main source of disagreement between myself and certain people who probably lean towards a crowdfunded government system, but more so idealistically lead away from government in general. And that's the struggle, is idealistically, there are certain beliefs that we may have. And in designing crowdfunded government, I always have kept that in mind, that if I'm too unrealistic with my vision, if I'm too dramatic, I will never get a chance for this idea to see the light of day. If it's too radical of a change from what we have now, I might as well be discussing pixie dust and fairies, because I'm going to be talking about an imaginary system that can never be put into place. So you do bring up a very good point, because I don't have the ability to be as idealistic as possible. The goal for a crowdfunded government is to create a system of rules, a set for government to follow that can ultimately be implemented on a large scale without the requirement of a massive revolution in order to do so.
Yeah. And I definitely understand the pessimism when it comes to, eventually seeing an anarcho-capitalist system in the United States, or in any country for that matter, in the near future, because I certainly am pessimistic. But the reason why I am an ideologue, or maybe a libertine, or however you want to describe it, is because I think that being pragmatic only leads to the same results that we've had this whole time. And so that defeats the purpose of the whole struggle, in my opinion, of going back. But
yes, you raise that is an excellent point, and it's something that I struggle with every day.
Yeah. The struggle's real in that regards.
Absolutely.
But, so, I mean, I did have an issue, something I wanted to discuss. I kind of wanted to go back to, what we were just talking about, so save that thought. But I also had another quibble with what I called this argument was the reverse tragedy of the commons argument, because if I can tell you straight up that if government was voluntarily funded, I would not pay a single penny. And there was the issue in Norway, and I understand that Norway is one of the most heavily taxed countries in the world, but they had, and I'm sure that you've heard of this, they had a system by which anyone who wanted to pay more taxes than they were required to by law, they could do so, and they had a program for this. And of the whole entire country, they raised about $1,300. And part of my argument is that the tragedy of the commons, right, is a problem with communism where no one puts in, but everyone takes out, right? Well, in this instance, I was kind of thinking of that psychological experiment in New York City where the woman was being raped in the alleyway, and there were hundreds of people that could hear her being raped, and they just walked on by because the responsibility diffused. Each one of them thought, someone else will take care of it.
It's the bystander effect.
Yeah, the bystander effect. Yeah. So
I know what you're talking about, and that was actually a very good point that was brought up to me by a friend when I was discussing this years ago. Exactly like your Scandinavian example, which is, do you know how much the government collects voluntarily? Because there is a place on your tax return where you can insert more money. One of the lines allows you to do that, and that line collects a comically low amount of money. And my friend was using that as an argument against voluntarily crowdfunding the government. The argument that I have in response to that is that we're not discussing a voluntarily crowdfunded system. We're discussing an involuntarily crowdfunded or an involuntarily funded system, which is already taking a huge chunk of your money for things that you don't support. It's no wonder nobody wants to give extra to that system. You're not choosing what it's going to, and you're not choosing how much. You're saying is, well, I don't like government, I'm going to give a little bit more. There's no way. I'm not surprised at all from your Scandinavian example and from our current system in the federal government, which allows you to give and that almost nobody does. That doesn't discourage me at all from the voluntarily crowdfunded argument. In fact, it bolsters my argument. And that actually ties in, I'm glad you brought that up too, because it ties into another discussion, which is that in certain municipalities, we are experimenting with crowdfunding certain programs. And some of them have been successful, but some of them have been laughably unsuccessful. So, for example, parks or trees or streetlights. You can find some examples of successes and find some examples of failures. And that's actually something that I'm extremely opposed to right now in our current system, is telling people that they're going to have to give 20, 30, 40, 50% of their income. And then, hey, if you'd like to give a little bit more, you can give to your local streetlight program. Well, forget that. Who would want to do? I completely understand why efforts for civic crowdfunding a lot of times fail under our current system, because you're trying to squeeze blood from a stone. You're taking a group of taxpayers who are already stretched thin enough, and now you're asking them to pay for something that, rightfully so, they thought their tax dollars were already going to these programs. So I do know what you're talking about, and I have heard it as a criticism of voluntarily crowdfunding government, but I like to turn that on its head. And I like to say that that actually shows me why involuntarily funding the government is never going to allow us to get to some type of a crowd-funded environment on a civic level. Just because we're already taking so much, it's no surprise that we can't get anything voluntarily civic funded at a civic level.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. And I would, have the same sentiment. And I do understand that the squeezing blood from a stone example. And I think that the Norwegian example isn't, the best example. But I think, so what I'm really seeing here is, and I remember talking to you about this in our Twitter direct messages, about how this just sounds like agorism to me, except dictated from the top down. And I think that politically it is just as unlikely as agorism. So if we're going to do it anyways, why don't we just advocate agorism or an anarcho-capitalist society? Because
I think that's a good point to make, in that we do need to encourage voluntarism across the board. The only reason that I've created sort of a top-down approach, or why I'm advocating all these rules and these systems, is because somehow we need to realistically get from where we are now, which is completely involuntary, completely from top-down rules stopping us from controlling what the government does with our money, and slowly getting to that point. The only way that I can see to do that, without a complete revolution, which I think is completely unrealistic, is to start somewhere. And to start somewhere, you still leave the top-down approach, but you introduce the voluntary aspect into our current top-down system. Otherwise, I just don't think we're ever going to see anything in our lifetime. If we're too unrealistic, if we're too demanding of a voluntary society, we're not going to get there anytime soon. That's where crowdfunding government, that's why I have to sacrifice my ideals sometimes, because I would love it if we had a completely bottom-up voluntary society. That would ultimately align much more with my political beliefs than the crowdfunded government top-down. All the rules still are in order. All of the politicians and all of the institutions still operate the same way. But I think that's the only realistic way that you can pitch an idea like this and expect it to take hold, is you don't want to change too much. You don't want to be too radical. There's always a future where once you prove that a top-down voluntary system can deliver the government services that the citizens want, now we can start talking about a bottom-up approach. Now we can start actually considering, what are these institutions that bind us together? What is the political system exactly? But I don't think you ever get to that discussion without starting somewhere. So that's why I do advocate a top-down approach, and I do agree with you. I completely agree with you that if it's not the best system, it's not where I want to be, ideally, it's just the only realistic way that I can see getting from where we are now to where a lot of us voluntarists want to be.
Okay, yeah. So I can see that we're on the same page here generally. So we're just talking about tactics then. But
yes, and that's the number one thing that angers me on Twitter among libertarians, anarchists, and capitalists, etc., is that we are too we are too forceful and aggressive with our message that we forget that it's a democratic republic, and we must figure out a way to have majority support some type of change to the system. Just because you're logically correct doesn't mean that you're going to be able to convince a majority of people that you're logically correct. People want a familiarity in their system, and that's really what I'm trying to design, some way to obtain popular support for an idea that is good in principle without having a system be so different that it completely blows everybody out of the water, that they say, wow, that's too big of a change. That's just too much to consider. I am putting in a certain level of statism. I'll be the first to admit it. It's top down. It still is top down statism. Crowdfunded government still has a state that is dictating to the people what to do. It's just not using your money involuntarily to do so.
Uh-huh. And so I mean, you would really probably agree with me on, well, so when it comes to top-down stuff, I have no faith in a top-down solution. I think that, either way, you're going to need a cultural revolution, and just the way that the state works and the inherent nature of the state, it is never going to give up. If you try and affect it from the top down, it is never going to give up its monopoly on the use of violence. And I don't think, and even if you put, the right people in charge, or even if you had a crowdfunded government, they are still in possession of the ring, to make a Lord of the Rings analogy. And so, but what I wanted to kind of get at though is, I understand wanting to go to the top-down solution in terms of kind of pragmatism, but perhaps perhaps I can direct you to the idea of agorism and further define it as I understand it, because I think, either way, you're going to need a cultural revolution, and kind of what you were talking about. I think even if you try and do the top down, and I would think that crowdfunded government would be completely politically unworkable. And that's anecdotal, but also in terms of, you would probably need a constitutional amendment, which would be a whole process in of itself. But when it comes to agorism, what I understand agorism being is that if you're talking about trying to create an anarcho-capitalist society on a small basis, you could do it maybe in a county or in a township, or I don't know, seasteading or Liberland or whatever, all those projects that they have. But the main mechanism that I see agorism as being is making the state obsolete through a better business model. And that's why I would advocate an agorist system, or, secession would be maybe one of the only top-down things I would advocate for. But from an agorist system, if you take Bitcoin, for instance, you don't need to convince people of anarcho-capitalism for Bitcoin to completely destroy the US dollar hegemony. You just have to convince them that the idea of Bitcoin is good. So if you can undermine and erode the state through that direction, that's what I would be looking for, because then you have a completely organic bottom-up revolution, but you don't have the power going into people's hands like that. You know what I mean? You don't have the possibility for it to be corrupted if your business model is good enough.
Yes, you do bring up a very good analogy, which is the reason that Bitcoin is succeeding is not through any edict or requirement or even argument being made by a certain person or people. It's literally the idea is winning.
Yeah.
The concept is what is turning people on, not any sort of directive to follow this. It's like, hey, all my followers, get behind this. Nobody has had to do that. Bitcoin has success because the proof is in the pudding with cryptocurrency. What it is what is making it successful. So I do see your analogy, and I do understand where you're coming from. That if the goal of a crowdfunded government system is to move toward a voluntary society, well, why not allow the proof to be in the pudding? Why not allow the benefits of a voluntary system to slowly but surely, and then all at once, overtake our current system from the bottom up? If enough people choose to stop participating in the current system and exchange their time and their resources in a voluntary society that at one point exists side by side in parallel with our current system and eventually gains enough followers and enough people that support it, I do see what you're saying. That would be how a bottom-up revolution would take place. I'm just proposing the crowd-funded system as a way for that to happen without requiring what I think is very difficult, that the bottom-up revolution. Like you actually brought up a very good point. You're going up against an institution that has the monopoly on violence. I want that institution that has a monopoly on violence. That's why I believe a top-down solution is so important, because I don't want to go up against that institution that has the monopoly on violence. I want to be in concert with, operating with, taking control of, from the top down. And like you said, it's a bold undertaking that requires some type of major change, whether that be a constitutional amendment or a series of new laws, which would of course require support from a lot of lawmakers. I agree with you that it's as difficult of an attempt as any. The only way that I could ever see getting that much voluntary interaction in a government is not from the bottom up to replace the current system, but from the top down to slowly but surely morph our current system into one that is more voluntary, slowly but surely. And actually, if I can just jump in really quick and mention one way that could be accomplished, I've discussed before an idea of how you convert our current system into a voluntary system. And I think the best way to do it might be a replacement approach versus some type of an approach where it's not all voluntary all at once. And let me give you an example. We all have a certain amount of tax dollars that we're currently contributing, and we're contributing those on a deficit basis to our government. That being, the government is spending more money than it's taking in. A way that you could consider introducing the concept of voluntarily crowdfunding government would to still have involuntary taxation, but to have those decisions being made by each taxpayer if they choose which programs they want to fund and which ones they don't. And that might be a slower way of introducing the concept of choice without completely demanding that the system change overnight into something that is very unrealistic. I think that might be an example of how you slowly introduce an idea of voluntarily crowdfunded government from the top down by saying, okay, everybody gets to distribute their dollars how they want to the programs, and the ones that don't get funding are the ones that don't get funded. That does not require a huge revolution, and it sort of would plant an idea in people's minds that, oh, what if we take this one step further? This actually worked out pretty well. Turns out there are some programs that the government does that some of us don't support as much. That's just one example of how I've been trying to make the system more realistic, because otherwise we're just discussing unicorns and fairy dust if there's not a real actual system and some maybe baby steps that can be used to implement it that could operate with our current system and not competing in parallel to it. My biggest fear is a voluntary effort against the government failing because we didn't take control of the monopoly of violence voluntarily, and we allowed that as the voluntary movement to operate as a threat to the current system. That's one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate of working with the state to accomplish this instead of against the state. Mm-hmm. And you do bring up a good point though, which is that if voluntary interactions with government are a good idea, eventually the market should be delivering that. And it currently doesn't. The government does not interact voluntarily with citizens ever. It is a completely involuntary, here are the rules, give us your money, thank you. So it is a good point, which is that somehow the proof should be in the pudding. Same thing with the Bitcoin analogy. If voluntary interactions with government are good, at some point, that should be happening organically. I just want to try to figure out ways to introduce it into the current system so that among the masses, among the populace, that can become an accepted idea. That allowing more choice, more decisions in government is a good idea. And then slowly allowing that snowball, the voluntary snowball, to slowly grow among the consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just have a couple points to make before we kind of wrap this up. But one thing that I wanted to say is that, we've tried the top-down approach before. The American Revolution was the most ideologically based revolution in the history of the world, and it was the most libertarian revolution as well. And it did exactly what we're trying to do, which is limit the size and scope of government and say, here are rules, you can't go past this. But it still didn't work, and I think at the end of the day, you are still advocating for a monopoly on the use of force. And that's just something that I can't bring myself to do. But one example,
and that's completely fine, by the way. That's criticisms on Twitter that I get, and I understand that. And idealistically, I agree with you. Realistically, I have to sometimes put my personal beliefs aside to try to create a system that is realistically implementable.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the last point that I wanted to make is that I don't think although I am pessimistic, I do not think that it is all unicorns and fairy dust, as you would say, because we can point to tangible examples like the Detroit Threat Management Center. I don't know if you heard the Commander Dale Brown, the leader of this organization, go on the Tom Woods show. But in Detroit, in the worst neighborhoods in Detroit, the regular people cannot rely on the police department for protection. So they, in place of the police department, has emerged the Detroit Threat Management Center, a private security firm that is full profit, but they are philanthropic, so they will help people out and they will protect people. And what I would posit is that what we need are more brave entrepreneurs that will undermine the state, not go up against it, and not exist, maybe exist parallel for a certain type of period of time, but undermine and destroy the state by making it obsolete, just like the Detroit Threat Management Center could, in terms of completely coming in so that people will turn to Detroit Threat Management Center or an organization like it before they would call the police.
I have not heard of that example, but that is a very good point to make, that might be an example of something existing in parallel to the state that doesn't threaten the state and actually reduces the burden that the state faces, and could be a good way to introduce voluntarism to the public, which is, here's a way we can do things more voluntarily instead of calling the goons with the guns. There's another way we can do it. Here's another group that can provide very similar functions, but it's funded differently and it's doing what needs to be done slightly differently. I can't wait to find out more about that. And that's the kind of stuff that I really like, because, like you've said, planting the seed, it's getting the idea out there, and that's a very good development. I have not heard of that.
Yeah. You're going to love it. I'll include a link in the show notes page too, and maybe I'll send it to you after we're done talking here. But, what the thing that I've kind of developed too with the podcast and stuff like that is the idea of guerrilla entrepreneurs. Techno-agorism, or just plain old agorism, is, coming up with these business models that will make the state obsolete. But, well, we're kind of bumping up against the time limit here, but I really appreciate you coming on the show, Theodore. I wish you all the best of luck in the future with your idea.
Well, Pat, thanks a lot for having me on here. Like you said, time limits are tough. There's a lot more I'd like to say, and I do appreciate the limited time that I've had, and really appreciate your feedback, and wish you the best of luck with the podcast. It's the podcasts that I've caught so far have been very enjoyable, and I can't wait to listen to them in the future. You got something good going on.
Oh, I appreciate that, buddy. And is there any last plugs that I think we should reiterate your website and your Twitter handle here?
Yeah, I would just say that my blog is www.crowdfundedgovernment.com, and Twitter handle is @crowdfundedgov, and on which both of those I will continue to spread the message and see how many followers we can get, how many, especially how much negative feedback I can get. My goal is to always get as much negative feedback as possible. I want to know, what are reasons? Why is voluntarily crowdfunding government a bad idea? I want to know. And every time I get a criticism, it helps strengthen my ideas, my resolve. So please, I love the negative feedback. Positive feedback doesn't help me out at all. I've got enough positive feedback in my own head about the idea. I love the criticism. I love the criticism you've given, and I love it whenever the internet rains the negative criticism down upon the ideas. It only strengthens the vision for a voluntarily crowdfunded government. Well,
you're a brave soul, Theodore. And there is a lot more to discuss. And I was going to say our friends at Peaceful Treason are always welcoming people on the show, and I know that you've interacted with them, so I don't want to obligate them to anything, but I'm sure they'd be willing to, kick around your ideas too.
Yeah, I've been talking to, I sent a message to them and a few other podcasts that are liberty-minded, and most of all, I also want to start getting into some podcasts that are not as liberty-minded, because, like I said, love the criticism, and anybody who's willing to give me a chance to talk about the idea, I really appreciate it, because the best thing we can do is have civil discussions in this society. There's no need to yell and point fingers and call names. Why don't we just talk about ideas for what they are and let the chips fall where they may? Let the truth be shown.
Definitely. Well, thanks a lot again, and to my audience, that's been Theodore with Crowdfunded Government.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.